21st Century Radio is sponsored by Hieronymus and Company. This is Talk Radio 680 WCBM. It's time now for award-winning 21st Century Radio. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Hieronymus.
While you're strolling down the fairway, showing no remorse, flowing from the poisons they've sprayed on your golf course. While you're busy sinking birdies and keeping your scorecard, the devil's been busy in your backyard.
Oh, yes, he has. The devil has been very busy in our backyard. And we got a big backyard. That's the reason why he's been so busy, I guess. Indeed. Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronymus, our executive producer and research assistant, Laura Corner, and our engineer is Anita Brockington. Now, before I introduce our guest, just a little update on the Woodstock bus. The light bus is still in San Francisco, where it is thrilling crowds wherever it goes. I mean, you should see these crowds. Whoa. It will return to Maryland in early August 2019, when it will carry my family to Bethelwood Center for the Arts for the 50th anniversary of Woodstock. And you can follow along with us and learn the light meditation on Facebook at www.lightvwbus.com. Our guest tonight for 2 hours is esoteric scholar Mark Stavish. Mark last joined us on 21st Century Radio in 1992. Well, that's 27 years ago, guys. When we were introduced to us by he was introduced to us by our future mutual friend, Paul Tratner, who had invited Mark to Maryland to participate in a seminar on the roots of the Western mystery tradition. Mark Stavish is a respected authority on Western spiritual traditions, the author of 26 books. 26 books, Mark, geez, published in 7 languages, including The Path of Alchemy and Kabbalah for Health and Wellness. He is the founder and director of the Institute for the Hermetic Studies and the Louis Claude de Saint Martin Fund. He has appeared on radio shows, television, and in major print media, including Coast to Coast and the History Channel, BBC, the New York Times, and the author of blog Vox Hermes. He lives in Wyoming, Pennsylvania. I didn't even know there was a Wyoming, Pennsylvania. We're going to talk to him about his new book, in which he provides instructions on how to identify egregores. Let's see. Free yourself from a parasitic and destructive collective entity and destroy an egregore should the need arise, revealing how egregores form the foundation of nearly all human interactions. The author shows how egregores have moved into popular culture and media. I'm not surprised. Underscoring the importance of intense selectivity in the information we accept and the ways we perceive the world and our place in it. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Mark.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back.
How have you been these last 27 years, brother?
Well, pretty busy, as you can tell from the introduction that you gave me.
27 books, 7 languages. My gosh, Rudy. How many languages can you speak?
Well, I don't do the translations. I tell folks that what happens is someone just decides they really like a book, and then they deal with the translations with the publishers overseas. Because trust me, I do not speak Russian or Estonian.
So you have a book in Russia?
Two in Russian, 2 in Estonian, 1 in Polish.
I got 1 in Russia, 1 in Germany, 1 in France, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we can't get into that. I wish we could talk more about that, Mark. But you last joined us 27 years ago, and thank you for reminding us about our dear friend, Brother Paul H. Tratner, a truly extraordinary soul. He was the vice president of the AUM Esoteric Study Center, of which I am the president. Did you know him well?
I didn't particularly know him well, although I did have to deal with him and his wife often. I would go down to the Baltimore area and D.C. because of David Burnett. Of course, you know Dave.
Yeah.
And he was involved with the Rosicrucian Order Amwork for many years, and as they were. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful time being involved in that in the 80s into the early 90s.
Boy, they were some time, I'm telling you. A lot of things were just coming together then, and things started to feel really good. Well, Tell us a little about your new book, Egregores. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Nobody gets it right, so don't worry about it. It's Greek.
It's Greek.
We say egregores, although some say egregores. And then I understand someone said that the second G should be silent as in gnome. But we just say egregores, the occult entities that watch over human destiny.
That's a very interesting title. That is really an interesting title. When I saw that, I thought, we got to have this guy on again. Because
you know what about the title? What's interesting is that we wanted something more creative, but that was just the working title, because that's what the book is about. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to get something snappier, but it just wasn't working, so we stayed with the working title, and it seems to have worked. It's taken off.
Yeah, good going. Congratulations, and well needed, because this is a subject seldom discussed or even understood. What, then, is the relationship between an egregore and a tulpa?
Well, that's a kind of a quick one to jump into. Tulpas are thought forms, but not all thought forms are tulpas. we could start with that.
Yeah, well, tell us what a tulpa is.
Well, that's just that comes from the writings of Alexandra David Neal and her experiences in Tibet in the the first third of the 20th century, in which she discusses the power of thought to create something which becomes tangible to others, first as kind of a sense or a feeling, and then visually, and then actually believably materially in some form. And, of course, her famous experiment was the creation of a thought form, if you will, of a jolly monk. And then, of course, the idea that she goes on in her story is that it takes on kind of a life of its own, and she has to go through a tremendous amount of effort to dissolve it and to bring it under control and to destroy it, to turn it back into its the place where it came from, her own mind, and just get rid of it. Now, a egregore is really the same thing. It's a thought form, but it exists on two forms. One is kind of the classical sense, and the classical sense of this thought form is that through our prayers and rituals and through our visualizations, we down here on Earth, in the physical world, have the potential or the ability to connect to not only the psychic domain, but also the intelligences and entities that exist within the psychic domain. Mm-hmm. And that this egregore then consists of those intelligences as well, whatever they may happen to be. We could think of them as, whether we call them gods or goddesses, demons or angels, whatever, or saints, and that these entities or intelligences can then work through this tunnel, if you will, this psychic conduit which we have created, the egregore, and its participating entities, and influence or affect life on Earth, and particularly for those who are involved. That's the classical definition. The other one which we deal with is kind of a more Jungian one, in which we just think of it as the collective attitude or beliefs of a group. Now, that has two parts, because you can have collective attitudes and beliefs of a group, but not necessarily have believe in anything psychic around it, okay, like a collective consciousness. We're going to err on the side of caution here and say that regardless of whether you believe in it or not, that it somehow is there, that there is this kind of amorphous psychic field that affects those who are within it. And that can be your PTA, that could be your golf club, that can be your esoteric order. It can be anything.
When did you first become aware of the notion of the egregore?
Well, anyone who's done any reading in Western esotericism, say even the writings of Elvis Lévy or any of the French Martinist or Rosicrucian writings, will have come across the word. It's there, but it's not really expounded upon. It's clearly delineated for you and defined, but we somehow escape it. The emphasis just isn't placed on it. And then in the 1990s, when I became involved with the Philosophers of Nature, the founder of that, Jean Dubuis, was very adamant about freeing oneself from the influence of these collective forces, these egregores. And I really didn't quite grasp it at first until I began to understand what he was talking about. Because so many of the esoteric orders, the occult orders, magic orders, you hear them talking more and more about their egregore at that time. Up until the early 90s, Amorc never used the term. You saw it loosely used by some of the British occult groups, okay, but you saw it becoming more of a thing. It was kind of a badge of honor, a sales pitch, if you will. And some will use a different term. They'll say we're a fully contacted order. I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with that phrase. Well, what they're saying, contacted or connected to what? Okay? And that's the egregore they're talking about. And, of course, he was familiar with a lot of the more shady side of things that go on in some of these groups, okay? As was Jacques Vallée. I think he was the guest on your show several times. There's things aren't always as they appear. So instead of having your psychic energy and idealism abused, as we can talk about later, he said just, separate yourself out from these as much as you can and just focus on your own path.
Yes, focus.
And that's really what triggered it. And then later on I would discuss this theme with the well-known esoteric author Jocelyn Godwin. And in fact, that's how the book came about. I was just having lunch with him, I think it was August of 2016 at the Lost Dog Cafe in Binghamton, New York. And I just said to him, hey, I'm thinking about writing this monograph on egregores. And he said, well, thank God, because if you don't, I'll have to. So
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? And then that's just it. Then it just took off. So it's like an egregore, it took on a life of its own, and then the book was written.
I'm glad you mentioned he's my favorite ufologist. He's more than a ufologist. My goodness gracious. Jacques Vallée was, in my opinion, so far ahead of his time in regards to what is really going on with alleged UFOs and real UFOs, etc. And I was just amazed as to how he could protect himself from falling into the same errors that so many other ufologists and others of taking advantage of information which is not substantial. And that's one of the things that you point out before, that if you're going to be using information, make sure it's some of the best you can get rather than maybe a bunch of theories, right?
Well, and that's the point. Whenever you're dealing with anything, and egregores that we deal with most often, that are most important to us in terms of manipulation, are of a religious or philosophical nature, or metaphysical, say religious or metaphysical nature, or of a political nature. And because of that, what they essentially need to do is abuse our goodwill. And, people don't want to believe that happens, but I've had extensive, professional and volunteer experience in social services, and can tell you that in almost all these charitable movements, your goodwill is abused extensively, okay? And that's the notion of these things. We see this with the cover-ups that have occurred in various religious movements regarding, child sexual abuse and adult sexual abuse, that the goodwill of individuals has to be manipulated or abused in some fashion. Same in politics. All these political fundraisers. And then we go out and we find out, what's really not happening with the money. So that being said, people become attached to an ideal. First, remember that they become attached to an ideal. And what is an ideal? What is an archetype? It's an image. It's a fantasy. It's a dream, but a very powerful and real one. It's a tulpa in that sense that they hope to create. They hope to change the world, okay, through their collective effort and action and are focused on it. So this dream becomes so powerful that they will essentially ignore all information to the contrary, even if it's destructive to them. And you can see that across history, and you can see that across the lives of people you know and your own life in different times. So again, we have to always step back and say, what's really happening here? Is this relationship good for me? You know, and is this too good to be true?
Well, you know, in my own personal life, I've had some real struggles with this, especially when it comes to animals. And because I know we're upon a break here, but I wanted to mention this, especially with the abuse of animals. Mm-hmm. So I make my boss, who is Laura Kortner in there, has told me time and time again, stop sending money to people that get in touch with me about donkeys, horses, dogs, rabbits, etc., etc., etc. Because once I start contributing in that area, I seem to have become a member of just about all these other organizations that try to reach me at the same time. And I feel terrible about it, and I know that I have to withdraw from it. I don't know if it's an egregore or not, but I do know that it's a struggle that I have, which is irrational in part. And with that, we better take a break here. Our guest is Mark Stavish. Egregores, the occult entities that watch over human destiny, published by our friends at Inner Traditions, HermeticInstitute.org. Egregores. Do you appreciate the Statue of Liberty as an American goddess? Well, we do, in our new book, Secret Life of Lady Liberty, Goddess in the New World. It's been described as a long overdue feminist and multi-ethnic history of the Statue of Liberty that surprisingly draws our country's entire history through this iconic image. Appreciating the Statue of Liberty as America's goddess allowed us to explore her Native American and feminist roots and to envision a sustainable future where liberty indeed prevails. What can the Statue of Liberty teach us about women's power? Well, find out at www.secretlifeofladyliberty.com. That's secretlifeofladyliberty.com.
Hi, I'm Jason Loeb, real-life wizard and author of John Dee and the Empire of Angels. You can find out more about me and magic at jasonloeb.com. And you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Bob Hieronymus.
Oh, goodness. Dr. John Dee. Dr. John Dee was the only person I ever wanted to be in Halloween. And then, of course, when I got dressed up as Dr. John Dee, nobody knew who I was, and when I told them, they still didn't know, so it didn't make any difference. So, do you remember Dr. John Dee? I'm sure you have.
Of course, of course.
Have you got that new book?
Yes, I got a review copy of it, and I did read it. In fact, there's some fellow who I haven't really read his stuff, but I'll give a plug for him if I can remember it. He has a website on something about alchemy in the Susquehanna, so maybe your listeners can look that up. He has some interesting stuff that he proposes about John Dee and the New World. So I spoke with him briefly, and I said, you know, this is the kind of stuff, I don't know if it's true, but it's a great story, and I want it to be.
That's right. That's right. Boy, there are a lot of great stories with John Dee, though. Really wonderful.
Yeah.
And some of them true, and some of them are. Well, were your experiences with various egregores positive or negative?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, well, enough of that. No.
Yeah, it's like anything. You know, when we're in it, sometimes it's negative and we don't know it. You know, sometimes it's positive, we don't know it. It's like being an adolescent. You know, clean your room and eat your beans. You know, it's good for you, but you don't know it. But it's like any group, because remember, egregores are essentially a social control mechanism. And of course, I grabbed that phrase from Jacques Vallée, you know, when he refers to the UFO experience.
Yeah.
Because anytime we have a UFO experience, whatever that happens to be, right? Whenever we have a paranormal experience, whatever that happens to be, and an egregore does fall within that domain of something paranormal, because we don't really understand what's going on. Remember, it is a cult, meaning it's hidden. Okay, it's not obvious to us at the time often. Even if we're told about it, we don't really have the markers to recognize it. It is a social control mechanism. And a lot of things that go on socially that shape us and direct us, like, how to have manners and be polite and hold the door, say please and thank you, these can be very beneficial to us. And the same with different groups we're in. I've been in a lot of groups, esoteric groups and non-esoteric groups, and they were, a mixed experience. They were very good at times and at times
not so good.
Questionable or just not so pleasant or just sometimes boring. And it's okay, well, that's nice, and it's time to go. Or you outgrow them.
Will you note that most of humanity is unconscious of the fact that they live and move in a world of phantasmagoria? What does that mean?
Well, of course, what does it mean to the phantasmagoria is they live and move in a world of imagination and a fantasy. And that fantasy and imagination is incredibly powerful. Ioannis Koulianos, in his book Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, which really is must reading for anyone who's interested in anything about the mind and the influence of images on the mind as an individual, but particularly on the masses, should be reading that book. We're constantly bombarded by imagery because speech comes after images. We see something and then we attempt to articulate it. And that whether that having to do with the earliest attempts at speech development in the human species, or even as we attempt to speak a foreign language and vaguely remember what the word is for a chair or a table. We see it, we attempt to articulate it in some fashion. So images have the most powerful effect on us. That's why the movement away from a literary culture, and we see that fewer and fewer people are reading, is extremely dangerous, because not only does it mean that the certain critical functions and imaginative functions aren't being developed, because as we read, we have to stop, and even if we don't really know we're doing it, attempt to formulate in our mind an image or form of some kind of what we're reading, what we're thinking of. Hence the famous power of fairy tales and tales of any kind, of storytellers across cultures, but even bedtime tales for children. The fantasy involved. My children used to love it when I tell them stories. No matter how boring they were, they simply liked the fact that I was telling it to them.
Sure.
Now instead we have it fed to us, not just spoon-fed, but shovel-fed to us with a steam shovel, constantly being hyper-stimulated with images of different kinds. And, of course, they are not all equally powerful, but they're not inert either. They have an effect on our psyches, on our emotional response. Let's be clear. They have an effect on our emotional response.
Well, you give several reports of some very negative experiences or egregores. Why did you pick those particular examples? And could you give us
Because they were extreme. I mean, if you're going to give an example of something like this, I felt that it was really important to give very powerful and extreme examples, because that way people who have had a similar experience would go, oh, wow, I'm not alone. Oh, wow, I'm not alone. It's both a good and a not-so-good thing. But many people won't have those extreme experiences. They may have something much lighter, but it gives them a perspective. It gives them a sense of what could have been and where they are in the spectrum. So I felt that if we were going to give an example, you need something extremely stark and polarizing so that it stands out. That's why I gave those examples.
Mm-hmm. I also was just very excited. Every time I hear Dion Fortune's name, the images from 40, 50 years ago go through my mind, and the thrills that I had in reading her work and feeling that I was becoming part of something. But Dion Fortune used to say that the best way of judging the spiritual health of any organization was not to take its public teachings as statements or proof of its integrity. So, according to her, what's the best way to judge spiritual health?
What was her best way of judging spiritual health?
Yes, what did she say?
I'm pretty sure she said to look at the students, if I remember correctly. She said look at how the students are acting. That's how you can tell the quality of it. I may be mistaken, but that's what, if I remember correctly.
Well, on page 30 you noted, by their fruits you shall know them.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
And I was so happy about this one particular area because her fruits are pretty great. How do you? I don't know how else you feel about that, Dion.
Well, it's very difficult because the different esoteric groups appeal to different types, different character types in people, and there is a tendency for us to gravitate towards the thing we're already strong in, and therefore create further imbalance. We may not know it, but we do, because it just feels so good because we're comfortable with it. It's really important that in any path we balance ourselves out. That's why you see this terrible habit in certain aspects of the educational system today, particularly in private schools, where the idea is that, well, you don't really have to learn anything. You just have to learn enough to know how to look it up. I've had students say that to me in the university. Or the idea is, well, I'm never going to be a mathematician. What do I need to take algebra for? What do I need geometry for? I'm not going to be an artist. What do I need to take art for? And the idea is to be well-rounded. And in that well-rounded, we bring out different aspects of ourselves that we normally wouldn't have. And we see within, so any esoteric group that forces you, holds your nose to it, if you will, to do things you really don't like so that you can be well-rounded, is probably going to be better off. But the problem is most groups today, because they're either mail order or they are, they're not, they can't. They simply don't have a traditional society, so they can't live in a traditional manner. They're highly dependent upon the generosity and check-writing ability of their members. So a lot of these groups don't put a lot of pressure on their students. So increasingly we're seeing that the fruits are not exactly what we would want them to be in a lot of groups. But that's, that basis of hers, she was a very powerful and dynamic person. And when she wrote those words, there was a whole different crop of students than there are today.
I'll say, yeah, that was quite a while ago. I'm trying to think of the dates, but right now they're not coming to my mind.
Well, it would have been in the 30s, probably in the 30s when she wrote, most likely. Yeah.
Well, I'm very comfortable with her books. Especially because long before that, I was not obviously, but I was first, of course, an agnostic, then an atheist, and then I rediscovered the whole banana after that. And
well, that's wonderful.
And felt, part of that had to do with I was going to be a priest, and unfortunately, when I got to spend time with others who were also going to, I realized that I didn't fit in at all in many ways, especially when we bumped into the Dead Sea Scrolls, or we talked about the Gnostics or something like that. They weren't necessarily very happy to discuss any of that, and bishops certainly basically pushed me in the direction of saying, well, this is not necessarily where you want to go, Bob. And of course, I was sad to do that because I had so many fond experiences when I worked on the altar. The experiences up there with the energy, the lights, and the lifting of yourself and consciousness is just extraordinary. And then when you bring this, you can talk to I've learned that you could talk to the female women, nuns, but I couldn't talk to any of the men about it, any of the males. It really was very disturbing, and it really changed my life considerably from that standpoint. But Oh, we're going to take a break right here on 21st Century Radio. Well, we are going to. Mark Stavish is our guest. Egregores, the occult entities that watch over human destiny, inner traditions, hermeticinstitute.org.
Hi, this is Barbara Hand Clow. I'm an internationally acclaimed ceremonial teacher, author, and a Mayan calendar researcher. And I've written, for example, Revelations of the Ruby Crystal, the Pleiadian Agenda, and the Mayan Code. I also have taught at sacred sites throughout the world. And my website is www.handclow2012.com. Thank you for joining Dr. Bob Hieronymus on 21st Century Radio.
Thank you, Barbara. Welcome back, 21st Century Radio, with our guest Mark Stavish. Egregores, the occult entities that watch over human destiny, Inner Traditions Publishing, or also you can go to hermeticinstitute.org. And we were talking about some of my limited experiences on the altar. And I think you kind of suggested that you might have had something similar.
Well, yeah, I just want to pick up on two things there. One is, during the commercial break, we had this wonderful commercial from St. Jude's, and the fellow said, it feels great to know that you're putting your energies into something that does such good work. And, being familiar with St. Jude's and other similar institutions, I can say, they do good work. So we're just picking them up because your listeners will have heard that. That's what happens in all of these things. Like when you were at the altar, you were putting your energies into something, and it felt good. And you had these wonderful experiences at the altar. That was the egregore. Okay, you were feeling this. It was just inside of you and outside of you, and all of these things were happening. But egregores they belong to duality. They're a created entity. They're a living being. So they have both positive aspects, which you were experiencing at the altar, and then they have negative aspects, which can be parasitic. And we often don't know that or recognize it. You kind of got an encounter with the more parasitic aspect when you went to talk about your experiences and other areas of personal growth. You were seeing that wasn't really accepted as part of the egregore as a whole. That the egregore was defining your experience. Remember we said it was a social control mechanism? Mm-hmm. It was defining your experience and then defining what you could say and defining what you could think and defining what you could express and discuss. And we see that today with what? With political correctness. Political correctness is essentially an egregore. It doesn't have a group, like we can point to it and say that's its headquarters and those are its rites and rituals. But whenever we start doing that excessive definition of this is what you can say, this is what you can't say, these are acceptable words, these are unacceptable, this is what you can think and feel, that's social control, and that is an egregore. So it's across the board in a variety of ways that we can see and experience it. But going back to the religious one, like you had at the altar, you're having this great uplifting experience, and you're beginning to wonder, well, what about the others? Aren't they having it too? Well, they very well may. Some don't. We know some people don't. But they very well may, but they can't integrate it. They can't fit it into the overall, and then it's done, and they go back to their daily life. And you can't imagine how many people I've heard that story from that you just told. I have these great uplifting experiences. But then when I went to the rest of it, it fell flat. Mm-hmm. Or I was told not to think about that or to talk about that.
Well, yeah, that's how you're guided anyway, not to talk about it.
Yeah.
Which I couldn't shut my mouth, unfortunately, and of course get yourself in trouble when you relate those experiences that others are not having. And also when you find out from the nuns that they know that they can't share any of that information. And if they do, they're going to be ignored. And that saddened me greatly because they were my good friends, people that I shared these things with. And I didn't expect anyone else to have felt those things. But as soon as I started talking about these energies that I see and lights that I saw being released, They all nodded their heads and said, "Oh, yes, that's da-da-da-da-da." So then, as you noted, there are positive egregores. And you mentioned the Golden Dawn and Amorc in your book. Could you explain those a little for our audience?
Well, whenever you get in a group, again, any kind of group, there's this kind of collective awareness or consciousness that guides and directs it, and it can be spontaneous, such as you join the local art league, the local art studio. Well, there becomes a certain way of doing things that's there, a certain kind of generality, archetypes or stereotypes that are in place. We see it all the time, okay? And that's fine because you're there to, put your art up and to talk about art and do those things. We see the same thing happen when we join philosophical groups or esoteric or spiritual groups. And that can be, very beneficial to us because the egregore kind of acts as bumpers, if you will. I'm sure all of your listeners have gone bowling at one time or another, and I'm sure some of them are expert bowlers, and some of them have even probably remembered that magical moment when they scored a perfect game or even just came close to one. And then I'm sure they all remember that moment when everything was a gutter ball. And, of course, when
that's a long moment.
Right, we all remember those. So, when you take kids bowling for the first few times, they're dropping it on the wood and they're barely getting the ball down the alley, and that's fine. But they put bumpers up, and the bumpers are to keep that ball rolling all the way to the end. And that's really, again, what the egregore does. It acts as kind of a bumper or a funnel or a conduit to keep you moving in a particular direction so you don't stray too far off course. Now, of course, those bumpers are up, and that ball may go all the way down, and it may just hit the right pin, and you get a strike, or you get a spare or something. Or it just goes to the edge, and you just knock one or two down. But slowly, as a child, you get better, and finally you don't have to bowl with the bumpers anymore. And that's what the egregores do for us. And, of course, Amorc went from nothing in 1909 and 1915 to a worldwide entity at its peak at around 1992, 93 was probably its peak period. It's been on a catastrophic decline since then for a variety of reasons. It's gone wider internationally, but in terms of its influence and size, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, it's not close to what it was. So you have this wonderful organization in which you could meet some really great people and have some great experiences. And that's a kind of esoteric egregore that was really wonderful in that, better half of the 20th century. The Golden Dawn had a different one, but at the same time, they were more open about what it was and how it worked on the individual member. And we see in the book where we talk about how the egregore can ingratiates itself into the individual, and Pat Zalewski, elucidates that in his book on how that works. Remember, the person is willingly participating. They're not just taken off the street. They're willingly opening themselves up to these other energies, these inner energies, both within themselves and external to themselves, these spiritual forces that are outside of them, so that they can grow as a person, grow within that organization, grow within that psychic forces, and become a more whole and more complete. So some of those egregores can be very powerful, they can be very potent, and very positive. But again, because all of them are of duality, all of them can at different times become parasitic or even toxic.
Well, how do you go about dismantling an egregore?
Well, it all depends. If it's just a personal separation, it can be very difficult, but it can be done. And for example, they're not limited to spiritual forces. As we said, they're also in pop culture too. We see them all the time. Okay, find anything that you're obsessed with. You have just an overwhelming attachment to in some way, and you'll see that people just can't let go of some of the either the heroes of their youth or their experiences of certain times. It's like the guy who was in the military for a few years, maybe when they're 18 to 25 or something like that, and it's been 20 years ago, but they're still wearing their U.S. Army cap or their Marine cap. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Mm-hmm. And that this is anything against Marines, but that's the nature of that overwhelming identification that's easy to see. we see other people who, I've been in line at Dunkin' Donuts, and, seeing people in their, 50s and 60s wearing Ozzy Osbourne T-shirts and talking to people about this. Mm-hmm. It's not that there's anything wrong with this. It's about when does something become so strong that it becomes an overwhelming identifier for you and is controlling and directing your life, whether you want it to or not. And that's the really important part here. This is the thing people have to decide. I'm not telling you not to listen to rock and roll. I'm just saying, or not to join the military, or not to do anything. I'm just saying, when does the individual things that you're doing, could be the PTA, could be the Art League, it could be anything, become so overwhelming in your life that that's all you identify with. That's what I'm talking about.
How do you dismantle the egregore, though?
Well, for yourself, you have to extract yourself from it, because dismantling it, we'll get into that in a moment. Mm-hmm. To get out of it is really you have to separate yourself from it, and just take all those things associated with it, put it in a box, and stick it in your closet for a month or two. 2 months is good, and just notice how your life feels freer. Now, you'll see this with people who are hyper-religious or hyper-New Agey, as I call them. Mm-hmm. They have to have pictures or icons or tapestries all around them all the time, reminding them of their spiritual dedication. I've seen people like that in politics. Whatever social cause they're in, it's all over the place. Their bumper stickers, their shirts. I mean, it just doesn't end, okay? Mm-hmm. I mean, really, you just want to say to them, get a life, because this isn't it, okay?
Yeah.
If you take all that away and put that in a box in a closet, what are you then? That's when the tension starts, because that's when you open up and have space. See, and in that space, the person has to be who they are. They first have to find themselves. They have to have freedom to be who they are and be okay with themselves without identifying with all these external causes, whether it be spiritual, political, philosophical, or what have you. Okay? Remember, it's know thyself. The purpose of spirituality is know thyself, not save the world.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that's beyond our pay grade.
Yeah, yes, I know, but most of us try to give a shot at it.
It's like, but you can't save it.
No,
you can't. You can only fix yourself and then fix the world to the degree that you fixed yourself. And there's a difference between the two. It's like, one of the commercials there was saying, we're going to end poverty and deforestation. No, you're not. You're not going to end it. This is samsara. This is duality. It's always going to be there. You're never going to end it. It will move. It will change. You will do good to the best of your ability. You will do good as best you can. Mm-hmm. But change is inevitable. Therefore, you will never get rid of it. And that's a very difficult thing for many people who have utopian ideals to grasp. And utopian ideals are one of the main motivators of late 20th century and early 21st century spirituality. And it's the main force of manipulation. It's the main force of abuse of people, because it's constantly directing their energies outside themselves, rather than into knowing themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's why Dubuis was one of the reasons why he was against, egregores, is because so many of them directed your energies all constantly to the outside of yourself, rather than directing your energies into know thyself. So then, the question you ask, how do you dismantle an egregore? Well, extremely violently. I mean, the only way an egregore can really be dismantled is through fire. You destroy everything to an ash. So that's why when you see in different times different items of a magical or profoundly powerful political interest are captured, they're destroyed in fire, completely burned. Mm-hmm. That's how it's done. No,
we're talking about a physical fire.
A physical fire. Everything's destroyed. Mm-hmm. Now, the egregore itself, to some degree, will still exist on a psychic level, but without the constant input from its physical people down here, without the material and mechanisms to support it, it will eventually wither and die. That's why you see, of course, as it becomes what happens is things become a cascading or an escalating feedback loop. So things cascade. You know, it's like, how do you go broke? Slow at first and then really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as the various churches begin to close, at first it's very slow, and then it becomes cascading. You know, as the different fraternal groups begin to close, first it's very slow, and then it becomes cascading very quickly. And then, of course, what are you left? You're left with a vacuum, because they provided a sense of meaning. So what do you see now in 2019? You see that most religious and spiritual groups, even the metaphysical, the neo-pagan, most of the esoteric, are functionally worthless on a spiritual domain, and they've replaced all their practices with some forms of political activism. And when metaphysical groups or religious groups promote political activism as their principal reason for being, they no longer have any connection to their initial spiritual force.
That sounds a lot like what's happened today.
Well, that's what's going on.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. What effect? Oh, nope, we don't have time for another question. My boss is telling me on that. But let me throw one other question in here. On page 24, you mentioned flying roll documents. What are flying roll documents?
Oh, those are just a wonderful piece of work created by some of the members in the Golden Dawn as lectures for their adept level grades. They're published. You can get them, and there's some very nice commentary on them out there. And within those flying rolls is the discussion, one of the discussions is of egregores. That's the technical document within the Golden Dawn where you could find that information.
Oh, I see. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's what it's for. It's basically, it's sort of like Amwork saying a monograph or something like that, or a lesson like you might find. They call them, I don't even know really where they got them from. I'd have to look it up again. But they call them flying rolls.
Well, time's up on this hour. We'll be back with Mark Stavish. Egregores, the occult entities that watch over human destiny, inner traditions, hermeticinstitute.org.
Stimulating talk and breaking news on Talk Radio 680 WCBM, Baltimore, and WCBM.com.